Education and war. The UN has established an international day to protect education from attack. But how can that make a difference on the ground? And what does it take to secure education in times of armed conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Kim Vanel. From Afghanistan to Myanmar and Syria to nations in Africa, school buildings are being bombed or used by armed groups in conflict zones. Students are missing out on schooling and teachers are threatened. The situation now worsened by the pandemic. The UN is particularly concerned about more than 75 million young people living in 35 crisis-affected countries. It says they're in urgent need of educational support. The world body recently adopted a resolution establishing September 9 as the International Day to protect education from attack. It aims to ensure schools remain safe and says governments should protect and increase funding for educational institutions in humanitarian emergencies. That resolution was presented by Qatar and co-sponsored by 62 countries. Well, the UN Secretary-General welcomed the unanimous decision by the General Assembly. The proclamation of 9th September as the International Day to protect education from attack, as safeguarding the right to education for all, contributes to the achievement of sustainable development and nurtures the international community's decades-long gains towards peace, economic prosperity and social inclusion worldwide. The chairperson of Qatar's Education Above All Foundation, Sheikha Moza bint Nasser, has advocated since September last year for a day dedicated to protect education from attack. She says attacks on schools must halt and perpetrators of these heinous attacks must be held to account so that the millions of children deprived of education in conflict settings can aspire to a better future. Education is their lifeline and we must protect it. Now, the UN estimates more than 300 million students were denied schooling in 2018. 1/3 of them live in countries affected by conflict or disaster. That's 1 in 3 children and young people living in conflict zones missing out on education. 5 countries in Central and West Africa accounted for more than a quarter of attacks on schools globally. In Afghanistan, assaults on schools tripled between 2017 and the following year. Nearly half of all school-aged children did not receive formal education. By the end of last year, more than 1,000 education and medical facilities had been attacked in Syria as the war continued. 2 million children are out of school in Yemen and another 4 million at risk of having to stay out. Let's now bring in our guests. Joining us in Amman, we have Therese Curran, Regional Education Advisor for the Middle East at the Norwegian Refugee Council. And in Doha, Maliha Malik, Executive Director at Protection of Education in Insecurity and Conflict for Education Above All. A warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us on the programme. Therese, I'd like to start with you if I can. From what you and your teams are seeing on the ground, why do we need this day, this UN Day dedicated to protect education from attack?
Thanks very much, Kim. Well, at NRC, one of the things that's absolutely crucial to us and something that's central to everything that we do is ensuring that children continue to access their right to learn, that they have that opportunity to not only access that right, but also to do it safely. Children and youth across the Middle East, where I'm currently working, as well as across the world in the 33 countries where NRC is working, are constantly under attack in their education experiences. And we all know that, of course, if we want to learn, we need to learn in safe places. We need to learn in places where we feel welcome, where we feel empowered, and where we feel encouraged. Something that helps us to ensure that hope continues to help us build our dreams and also to build our learning.
We'll talk a little bit later in the programme about what impact not getting an education has. But Maliha, I'd like to come to you and about asking how effective do you think this initiative, this International Day will be in actually averting attacks? There are, of course, those attacks that stem from organised militaries targeting schools or using schools as bases and becoming targets. But how do you get the likes of Boko Haram to adhere to a resolution?
I think the really significant thing about this resolution is it provides a global mobilizing moment for all of us to come together, and to come together as a global community, all levels of society, top, down, youth, civil society, NGOs, including those who are affected in Nigeria itself, to come together and say enough is enough. We're not going to tolerate this kind of violence against learners, against children who should be safe to play, against young women in Nigeria who are seeking out knowledge, which is their absolute basic fundamental right. And I think the significant thing about this day is that it provides a really important way of providing all of us with a structure, a permanent structure under which we can put all our energies to try and bring about change.
OK, Therese, the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack reports that in Afghanistan, documented threats and intimidation of teachers increased from 2013 to 2016, even as targeted killings actually declined. Most of those threats were directed towards girls' education. How do you avert attacks that stem from religious or ideological beliefs?
Well, one of the things that's most important is working together with communities, trying to ensure that communities themselves understand what the importance of education is, and where possible, having dialogue with other groups, particularly military actors where possible, engaging with the UN and other actors so that they can support those conversations to help people to understand what it is that we are trying to achieve, that education is important. It is a human right. It is something that every child, every youth deserves to access. So very much open dialogue, but I think it's also very much supported by having systems in place that ensure that, yes, we have international humanitarian law. Yes, it's important. Yes, people need to understand it. But unless there are actions taken when people contravene this law and don't respect this law, then no matter how much communities understand and respect education, it's going to be very difficult if action's not taken when that is not respected.
Well, that brings me nicely to my next question. Maliha, you're a professor of law as well as working with education above all. We have the Geneva Convention, we have international law, which says civilians and civilian objects should not be targeted, and yet we see it happen with no consequence. I'd like to just quote quickly, if I can, from the UNHCR about attacks predominantly by Israel on the Palestinian territories, and I quote, "In the West Bank, military operations by Israeli security forces and attacks by Israeli settlers harmed Palestinian students, educational personnel, schools, universities. In Gaza, airstrikes and mortar shells damaged or destroyed hundreds of Palestinian schools and universities, most of them in 2014. So, Maliha, my question is international law failing children?
I think that that's a really fair observation. I have to start off by saying that we have a fantastic normative system in place on the books. We've got 2 or 3 different strands of international law, humanitarian law, human rights law, international criminal law, all of which provide remedies and ways of holding perpetrators to account. All of those legal institutions also on political will for enforcement. That said, I think that there is some political will. There are cases being considered at the International Criminal Court, including cases relating to the Palestinian-Israeli dispute. So I think there is some progress, but I agree with you. It's just shockingly slow. I think there is a mechanism, another mechanism, a non-legal mechanism, which is the Security Council. I think there is some potential for putting into place political mechanisms for accountability in global governance institutions such as the Security Council that will help. I think finally, it's worth saying that I think we can't really give up on accountability. I think Therese is right to say we need open dialogue with perpetrators to try and get. There's been remarkable success by the conflict process to try and get release of prisoners by Boko Haram, for example. But we need accountability. We do need people to know that if they attack schools, if they attack children in places where they should be safe to play and learn, there will be consequences. And we, as a world community, will not tolerate these sort of criminal acts.
Coming back to that specific example I gave, the conflict in Gaza in 2014, do you think there was accountability for all of the attacks on education centres?
Well, the International Criminal Court is looking at evidence relating to some of those bombings. There hasn't been accountability. There isn't accountability, which is partly why my program was established 10 years ago. The founder of the program, Sheikha Moza, Her Highness Sheikha Moza, recognized that actually there needed to be political leadership. There needed to be a really important specialist project, such as my project, which is called Protect Education in Security and Conflict. And following that, we've been working for 10 years on this subject, and the UN resolution is an absolutely wonderful culmination of the work of that 10 years. But we're not going to stop, going to carry on being ambitious, because we recognize the point you've made, Kim, which is there is accountability in contexts like the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, but also in South Sudan or in Colombia, for those perpetrators who deliberately and heinously target schools and educational facilities, teachers, and children who are playing.
When we think, Therese, I'd like to come to you. When we think of, say, Yemen, Libya, Syria, which I know you focus on, and we're talking proxy wars exacerbated by countries with competing interests who are giving support to competing parties on the ground. And of course, these conflicts are impacting children's access to education. What responsibility should these countries bear for supporting these conflicts?
I think one of the most important things is that we need to remember that we need to work together with communities, and we need to be sure, based on what communities are highlighting is important and what the needs are in their communities, that we're able to respond to those. So when communities value the inclusion of their children into a formal system that recognises their learning across a country, then that's really important to work towards, and that it's not only about the particular perspective of a country who's supporting the education programming, but also listening very closely to the communities about what it is that they want, what's the end goal that they want for their children so they can achieve their dreams.
But I'm asking about international accountability.
Well, I think that one of the things that we need to be able to do is that we need to have more global conversations when it comes to these sorts of issues, discussing what is the place in education for the political perspective of particular countries and particular supporters of education, versus what are the actual needs on the ground and what is actually going to help to achieve those. So sometimes those conversations are very challenging because, of course, everybody across the world from their different political perspectives has their own perspectives, has their own accountability at home in their own countries, which sometimes doesn't always support or help the particular action that's trying to be achieved on the ground in a country where we're trying to aim towards helping children who have names, who have dreams, to actually achieve those. And
Maliha, I saw you wanted to add to that. What were you going to say there, Maliha?
Well, I was going to say, actually, I think you need both. I think that you need both accountability, which is global, national, legal systems, need to ensure that there's accountability for attacks on education. And we need to work with communities themselves to ensure that their voices come through. I mean, the example I'd like to give is there's research that was done in places like Afghanistan, where it's assumed that girls' education isn't valued. When you actually ask local communities, including those who express sympathy towards the Taliban, about the value that they place on education, everyone places a very high value on education. And we need to cut through complex conversations and make sure that that commitment, that universal commitment to the power and the vision of the transformative effect of education in communities. I think you can't replace global governance institutions. You can't replace accountability. And that is why, Kim, this day, the UN resolution, this achievement is so important, because the UN as a multilateral organization needs to take leadership to try and build and provide the vision and the leadership to take us forward. We at Education, above all, are absolutely committed. We've been doing this for 10 years. We put out a call to everyone to join us, to join UN agencies, to come up with ideas and your energy and make attacks on education an absolute thing of the past. We are zero strategy, no deliberate attacks on schools. And last week, we celebrated 5 years of the Safe Schools Declaration. We want everyone to sign up to it. We want NGOs, we want all leaders, etc., to sign up, not just to the Safe Schools Declaration, but to just make no attacks on schools, education, teachers and pupils a reality.
Therese, what impact does interrupted access to education have for children long term and for communities long term across generations?
Well, it has an enormous impact, and it has an enormous impact on individuals as well. And I mean, so far we've managed to talk about communities and different levels of decision making, but perhaps just to share one example, we have a young person that we've been working with in recent months, and this young person is called Sham. She's 19, and she says, when I was in grade 9, during class, we heard the sound of a warplane, and my school was bombed. A group of students died, and some students were injured by the scattered glass. After the incident, I was in bad shape mentally, and I became afraid to go to school. So at grade 9, 14 years of age, Sham never returned to school. And Sham is the perfect example of what the impact is of attacks on schools. And one of the things that's really important about this day, it's not only important for Sham and young people like Sham who've lost 8, 10, 12 years of schooling because of the attack that happened in their school, or because of the violence on the road to school when they were trying to get to school safely, or because of the checkpoint that they had to pass. It's really important. Also, this day is so important because it sends a message to the children who have lived through these things. It sends a message to the communities who are constantly frustrated by the attacks on school and the fact that global coalitions exist, but don't see the impact improving in their communities. And so it also encourages them to report, to come forward and say, this happened in our community, and to report it and have it investigated. So apart from that, the impact also is the loss of learning, the loss of dreams, the loss of the heart of a community. When a school is bombed, a school is the heart of a community. It creates fear. When children don't want to go to school because they're afraid, when parents don't want to send their children to school because they're afraid, when teachers don't want to live in a community because they're afraid, then we see devastating impact on schooling, on education, not just now, but for the generations to come, where children and youth have missed their opportunities to access their right to learn. So this day helps them to be aware, to know, to hold others to account that my school should be safe and I deserve to learn in a safe place.
I mean, arguably, Therese, that point you made, a school being the heart of a community, is the very reason that sometimes schools are targeted. I mean, how do you communicate that message that is not okay, and how do you get people to adhere to that message?
Well, I think it's a very challenging thing to do, and in every community, in every country, it's going to be a difficult discussion, and that's the reason why, when we work, for example, in organisations like NRC, education does not work on its own. We also work with other parts to our organisation, whether it's about shelter or food security, but more importantly in NRC, we also work with a very strong, passionate group of lawyers who not only ensure that young people have access to school because they have the documentation, the birth certificates, etc., that they need to enter school, but they're also the ones who do the research about the impact in communities that a failure to acknowledge this has, and then works together with our advocacy people to try to promote positive messages and sometimes very difficult messages to all different levels of the global structure, to encourage them to take action, to watch, to see.
Maliha, the impact of attacks on education, on students, are particularly grave for women and girls. Why is that?
I think, just to say, I really strongly agree with what Therese said about the need for justice for victims to be able to see that the world community is doing something about their suffering. And I think the way Therese expressed that was really moving. I think in relation to girls and young women, you can get a range of different ways in which they're specifically targeted. Of course, you have specific targeting of girls' schools, which is an example really of misogyny or a belief that women shouldn't have knowledge, that they don't have a place as far as education is concerned. But there are also indirect ways. The fact that there's an attack on a school means that women are disproportionately less likely to be able to take the risk to go to school, to return to school. So research that was done by the GCPA on the impact of attacks on women and girls has demonstrated that there are both positive and also indirect consequences for women and girls. And you know, Kim, the thing is that this picture that I think your opening piece pointed about unrelenting conflict during the times in which we live. I think one thing about education is quality education is it has the potential to, if it's correctly and fairly distributed, to break this cycle of conflict, to reduce the length of conflict and to allow communities to build peace. So I think there's really a lot of stake here. I think all of us need to take the role of quality education and its potential to end conflict much more seriously.
Therese, your work right now focuses on providing strategic technical advice and support to NRC teams working inside Syria. What do you think, after 9 years of war, what are the major challenges for ensuring access to education for Syrian children going forward?
Well, generally, we find from the research that's been done, both by the cluster and other organisations in education, there's three main reasons why children choose not to access education, or their parents choose. The first one is because it's not safe. So whether it's walking to school, whether it's checkpoints, whether it's the actual attacks on schools physically, they don't feel safe being at school. Another one is the infrastructure has been so damaged. There are some parts of the country where there are more than 5,000 schools on the ground, and yet they're trying to educate 65% of the children in the country. So when you have so much devastation and it's so challenging to get organisations, donors, etc., from across the world to support the rebuilding of schools, the heart of the community, bringing people back to their communities, helping them to once again feel like they feel welcome in their home. And the third reason is, that's claimed by many, many parents and very correct, is that we've lost more than 130,000 teachers from Syria. And so they often complain about the quality and the fact that teachers are good people and they're working hard, but they struggle because they aren't trained, or they're in the process of being trained and they're not yet able to provide the quality of education that Syrian people were used to receiving prior to the conflict.
OK, we're coming nearing to the end of the programme now. Maliha, I'd like to end with you. What can the international community do to avoid having a generation of young people coming through who have not had access to education and everything that comes along with that?
So I think clearly one thing is provision, which is to make the commitment, both financial, but not just financial, practical commitment to deliver quality education. But I think in relation to the topic we're discussing today, I think the UN resolution is a good start, but it's only a start. We need to come together with ideas, with vision, with ambition, and to have our hearts on fire, but our brain firmly on ice as we put together coalitions to try and bring about change. And I think it's not just a top-down approach. I don't think it's just about people in New York deciding what should be done. I think we need to establish a mobilization, a movement of NGOs, youth, and just say enough is enough. We will not tolerate this anymore, either in communities or international state actors such as in Syria or in Yemen, attacking schools using unbelievable firepower on impoverished communities during war.
We'll have to leave it there for time. We really appreciate both of you coming on the programme and, of course, all of the work that you are doing. Therese Curran there and Maliha Malik, thank you very much. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story, or you can message me directly at Kim Vanel from me and the whole team here. Bye-bye for now.